Hello and welcome to 3 Minute Gaming. I'm Nathan. Today I have a review of an entire gaming series. Today's series is all of the God of War games in order of release. Yes, every single God of War game is here, except for that one cell phone game, which I did actually have on my Nokia flip phone. But aside from that, we've got all of the originals and the reboot franchise. Which of these games are worth playing and which should be sacrificed to the gods? Well, you're about to find out, so sit back, relax, and enjoy reviews of every single God of War game. Hello and welcome to 3 Minute Gaming. I'm Nathan, and I'm going to take up this games with your time and bandwidth. Today's game is God of War 1. Yes, we are jumping back to the past to the game that started Kratos' murder spree through the Greek pantheon. How does God of War 1 hold up? God of War 1 was originally released way back in the day on PlayStation 2. It got an HD re-release on Vita and PS3. To play it now, you're going to need a PlayStation Plus premium subscription where you can stream the PS3 version to your PS5, which is how I played it, and the game is about 9 to 10 hours long. So what exactly is God of War? Well, it's a 3D action platformer originally released on the PS2 with an emphasis on puzzles, great feeling combat, and the main character's abject brutality. You play as Kratos, mortal who swore his life to Ares, and because of that was tricked into murdering his own family. Swearing revenge, he's sent by Athena to Pandora's temple to retrieve Pandora's box, a MacGuffin that'll probably let him kill Ares in a one-on-one Street Fighter battle. Probably. The first game does well at both establishing Kratos and making him very sympathetic, as while he's a bit of a brutal monster, you do see his remorse for what he's become, and how he views revenge as the only thing left in his life. This characterization would basically be gutted for games 2 and 3, but hey, it's good here. The meat of this game is the meat you will be ripping apart in the form of Greek mythological creatures. Kratos' combat has been compared to Devil May Cry, although it's not nearly as complex. His primary weapon, the Blades of Chaos, have exceptional range and a whole host of combos to learn to pull off, with more unlocking as you spend red orbs to upgrade your various powers. Speaking of powers, you also gain a variety of magical abilities such as an AoE stun, a ranged lightning bolt, and a completely overpowered Medusa head, all of which can be upgraded as well. Oh, you also get a secondary weapon that isn't actually that great, starting a God of War tradition of every weapon beside the chain blades being a bit redundant. Knocking an enemy's health down enough allows you to execute them with a quick time event, which often results in either more XP, or in the case of certain enemies, healing or magic in lieu of XP. These executions are brutal and are probably the most well-remembered parts of God of War. The adventure itself spans multiple areas, from Athens to the surrounding desert, and finally the temple itself, which exists as a bit of Prince of Persia-esque puzzle experience, with you returning to zones with key items to unlock new paths. The game also has a very heavy emphasis on platforming, and particularly traps, with that culminating in an escape from Hades, which is rather infamous for how bad it is. Of course, the series is well known for its big bombastic set pieces, and while it didn't really kick off as much until the second game, there's no denying the scope and grandeur of this one, especially on the PS2. The fixed camera also allows for some really cinematic shots as you explore the temple. So all in all, this first God of War game set the foundation upon which the rest of the series would be built, and was a hell of a first game in a series to kick things off. So what do I like about God of War? Well, the combat still feels fantastic. Some of the first try, they managed to make Kratos' entire moveset feel satisfying and easy to pull off, to the point where they didn't even really change it much in the future games. Additionally, the set pieces and environments are phenomenal, and this is paired with some really phenomenal pacing that keeps the game engaging from start to finish. And lastly, I actually really did like this game's first story quite a bit. Learn how Kratos, this muscle murder dickhead, is actually a sympathetic character over the course of the game, and humanizing him makes him considerably more interesting. When it comes to the bad, platforming generally is a little janky until it gets really bad once you hit Hades, with how completely awful that section and its rotating blade pillars are. I'm not saying it's all bad, but even the best sections feel a bit half-baked. Additionally, this game only has 2 bosses, with the final boss in particular being a pretty dang terrible in its design, where it starts as a more traditional boss and then becomes kind of a weird tug-of-war Street Fighter thing, and that wasn't huge on it. And on that note, this game as a whole kind of feels a bit like a prototype for future games, with there being more than a few rough edges, janky segments, and some really weird choices, like a lot of the QTE murders not giving experience, for example. As you know, rate games here in a 3-point scale: must play, maybe consider, don't bother. And looking back on God of War today, I would say it's probably a maybe consider. It is still a lot of fun, but it certainly feels more like a rough blueprint upon which the future games are refined. Its ambitious and gory brutality cannot be denied, but it's marred by some absolutely awful platforming, weird balancing issues, and a general roughness. My rating shouldn't really matter though if you're going to play the entire series, because you should still just start with this one, and you will still absolutely have a good time, but it definitely feels outclassed by almost all of its successors. Hey Sony, how about instead of remaking Last of Us, you remake God of War 1? Today's game is God of War 2. Kratos is back as the God of War, and he's pretty much had it with his fellow gods. Is this first of a 2-parter in God Murder worth playing? God of War 2 was released on PS2, PS3, and PlayStation Vita. If you wish to play it currently, you're going to need a PlayStation Plus premium subscription so you can stream it to your console of choice. And the game is about 11 to 13 hours long, depending on difficulty you're playing on. So what exactly is God of War 2? Well, it's more God of War 1, a third-person action game with an emphasis on great, free-flowing combat, brutal kills, and absolutely insane action set pieces. Kratos is back back and is now the god of war, and he is pissed. Nothing new going on there. He didn't want to be a god, he just wanted to be happy. So he's taking his grumbling out on basically everybody. The rest of the gods of Olympus having enough of his BS interfere, and Zeus himself kills Kratos. While being dragged to the underworld, Gaia, one of the Titans, enlists Kratos to free the Titans and revive the ancient war against Olympus. To do this, he'll need to go to the Sisters of Fate, who live on the Temple of Fate on the Island of Fate. Yeah, imaginative names. To change his, fate, so he can kick Zeus's butt. For those wondering, this is the game where Kratos basically stopped being an actual character and instead an embodiment of rage and murder, which they have since attempted to retcon a bit in both the reboot games and the PSP spin-offs. But even then, it is pretty entertaining to watch Kratos murder not only Greek monsters, but also myths, such as Theseus on his quest to kill Zeus. Combat is basically just a refinement of the first game, in that combos and special moves feel smoother, targeting is better, and everything just looks flashier. You'll get multiple new weapons this time, but usually late enough in the game that you'll ignore them. So if you enjoyed the first game's combat, you will love this one, as it improves on it in almost every way. And all the upcoming games too, spoiler alert, they don't mix it up that much. What is different here is the game's length and scope, as this game is the longest of the franchise pre-reboot, and has some absolutely insane spectacle and set pieces. Now that Kratos is a god, he can do even nuttier stuff and kill bigger things, which usually requires pressing quick time event buttons, which are back, unfortunately. The game has a rather excellent flow and mixture of puzzles, bombastic action set pieces, tons of excellent bosses, and the progression system feels much better and smoother than the first game overall. The game also mixes stuff up with some flying segments and a few other side things that are pretty fun too. It's worth noting that this game looks incredible even today, with the HD version looking more like an early PS3 game than a late PS2 game. Not only is it technically impressive, but artistically as well, with some absolutely fantastic landscapes, enemies, and creative spins on Greek mythology. So yeah, God of War 2 is more God of War, just with less character development and more insanity, violence, and refined combat, which is honestly pretty much all it needed. So what do I like about God of War 2? Well, this game just feels so good to play, particularly the combat. All of my gripes from the first game I feel have been smoothed over in that regard, and with a wider variety of enemies to kill and moves to learn, this game just feels great. Additionally, as mentioned, this game's pacing is pretty much perfect. It leads from one insane set piece to the next, split up with some fantastic puzzle designs and some really incredible environments for you to engage with. If you love Greek mythology, there is so much here to dig into. And lastly, as mentioned, this game still looks quite good, even for an upscaled PS2 game. If for some reason Sony decided to put this game out on the Switch today, I think people would think it looks incredible. When it comes to the bad, as mentioned, the side weapons are basically worthless, as by the time you get them, your change will be so upgraded there's no reason to ever consider them. They also don't feel as good to play, so there's that. Additionally, Kratos as a character is basically devolved into nothing more than a rage murder man, with the story itself and his quest to revenge so paper thin it's almost comical. And lastly, the QTEs, particularly on the final boss, lead to more than a few unfair or unwarranted deaths. The QTE system is already starting to feel a bit tired here. As you know, I rate games here on a 3-point scale. Must play, we consider don't bother. I absolutely think God of War 2 is a must play. I'll just be completely transparent. I think this is the best pre-reboot God of War game. Its set pieces are phenomenal, its combat is excellent, the graphics still look really good, and its goofy B-movie story and Kratos' dumb rage all lead to an incredibly entertaining and well-paced experience. God of War 2 is absolutely worth seeking out today, even if you have to use PS Plus streaming to play it. Today's game is God of War Chains of Olympus. Kratos is here in handheld form, with his first PSP outing. Does this bombastic, massive franchise actually fit in the palm of your hand? God of War Chains of Olympus was released on PSP and PS3 in an HD remaster. For a while, it was available via PlayStation Now on streaming, but when it switched to PS Plus, Sony took it off, and I don't know why. So now the only way to play it is through original hardware, or that other way that I'm sure you're familiar with. Regardless of how you play it, however, the game will take you about 5 to 7 hours. So what exactly is God of War Chains of Olympus? Well, it's a bite-sized God of War that maintains a lot of what makes the series great, just compressed to fit on the tiny PSP. The story takes place before God of War, where Kratos is still in service to the gods. Helios, god of the sun, has gone missing, allowing Morpheus, the god of dreams, not the guy from the Matrix, to sleep the whole world, mortal and god alike, except Kratos for some reason. It's up to Kratos to save Helios, which involves solving puzzles in Helios' temple, traversing to the base of Mount Olympus, and eventually to the edge of the underworld and into Elysium, amongst other things. All of Ready at Dawn's PSP God of War games are spin-offs to the main series, but also try to actually do character development with Kratos by virtue of them happening before God of War 2, and this one's no exception. It digs into Kratos' relationship with his dead wife and daughter in interesting ways, attempting to humanize this murder machine in a bid to make it more interesting, as well as set up for the events of God of War 1. Aside from the story, this game is basically if you distilled God of War down to its essence. You have just the chains of Olympus and a limited supply of magic, so the combat stays pretty similar from beginning to end. The game also understandably has fewer enemies and slightly less bombastic encounters. That being said, the core combat is good enough that it does hold up over its short length, and the game does still try to send Kratos to some interesting places visually to keep the game engaging throughout. The game does keep a lot of the series' crazy set pieces, so they are toned down, as Kratos isn't a god yet, and this is on the PSP, as well as the massive enemies to fight and brutal executions. It also strips down the platforming quite a bit, as all games did post God of of War 1, which means the combat is the primary gameplay interaction. And honestly, there isn't much more to say about this one. It is more God of War, just with a bunch of excess stuff removed to fit it on the PSP, but the core is strong enough that the game still plays well, particularly on the PS3 where you have a second stick to roll. So what do I like about God of War Chains of Olympus? Well, it manages to translate the core elements, including the crazy spectacle of God of War from console to handheld, well enough. The essence of God of War still feels like it's here. And speaking of the essence of God of War, combat still feels fantastic, with Kratos still sporting his core moves from the first two games, and the overall flow and pacing of the game feeling great. And lastly, I found the story to be surprisingly decent, even if it does really only kick in till the second half. I like the games in the series that lean into Kratos' past because they allow some depth of his character that help you better understand why he's a murder machine, which I feel they didn't really try to do that much in God of War 2 and 3. When it comes to the bad, the game has a massively limited number of weapons, upgrades, and magic when compared to the other games, which definitely leans into that budget God of War feel. Additionally, and this should not be a surprise, the graphics are the worst in the franchise. This was a perfectly serviceably looking PSP game at the time, and I wouldn't say it looks terrible, but of all the games, this one definitely shows its age the most, especially on the PS3 in the HD version. And lastly, the gameplay overall feels very basic when compared to the previous games. Again, I feel like the core is good and the short length doesn't hurt this too bad, but I definitely was starting to feel that this game really could have used maybe a couple more magics or something else to really spice it up by the time I hit the end. As you know, rate games here on a 3-point scale: must play, maybe consider, and don't bother. And I think God of War Chains of Olympus is a maybe consider. And I'll admit, I do have a soft spot for it. It's short, fairly basic, and certainly doesn't stand up to its big brothers in the console space, but even so, it's nice to have a bite-sized Kratos experience. The emphasis on Kratos' past and the really good story beats in the latter half certainly help elevate it, so if you have the means to play it, I'd say still give it a look. Just make sure to keep your expectations in check. Today's game is God of War 3. Kratos will have his revenge against God, Titan, and probably his server at Applebee's for not topping off his martini. Is this final mainline God of War game worth playing today? God of War 3 originally released on PlayStation 3, and then they released a remaster on PS4, and that remaster is available if you have a PlayStation Plus premium subscription. If you do not, it will cost you $20, and the game is about 9 to 10 hours long. So what exactly is God of War 3? Well, it's the final game in the original God of War trilogy, and chronologically the last game before the reboot. Similar to the previous games, it's a third-person action experience with fixed camera angles, great feeling combat, and tons of ridiculous set pieces. Kratos is pissed. Big surprise, with the game picking off exactly after the massive cliffhanger at the end of God of War 2, where he and the Titans are assaulting Olympus. Of course, you can't just go and win the first 5 minutes of the game, so things go awry, and Kratos is now pissed against gods and Titans, so he's gonna just kill everybody on his way to the top just to be sure. The story here is probably the weakest in the whole series in my opinion, as Kratos isn't really even a character anymore, and the whole plot focuses around finding the MacGuffin from the first game, just on fire now, with the story's highlights being Kratos' interactions with the various gods and Titans before he murders them. And murder them you shell across a ton of crazy set pieces. The set pieces are the biggest and craziest in the series, with Kratos bouncing between Olympus and Hades like there's vacation homes, and the brutal executions ramping up more and more as the game progresses. Combat is the same as the previous games with two big twists. The first being they finally figured out what to do with the L1 plus circle combo, as Kratos will now grab enemies and launch himself to them, providing an excellent gap closer and allowing combat to flow more smoothly. I know that's weird to highlight a single move, but it really does improve the game significantly. The other big change is sub-weapons, which no longer use magic but a recharging strength meter that has its own upgrades, meaning you'll always have a ranged option should you need it, as well as a flashlight, which can stun, running shoes, which can also stun, and so on. It's a smart addition and allows for more ranged combat diversity since it no longer is reliant on magic. In addition to that, they have refined the combat down to a sheen. While Kratos' combos haven't significantly changed, QTEs are a lot easier now. Kratos climbs, slides, and does everything faster. Bosses should definitely be mentioned as they are the highlight of the game, with most being over the top, as well as having additional stages requiring different strategies to complete. It's really funny to me how God of War 1 only had 2 real bosses, and this one just has a bajillion, and they're all great. So God of War 3 is the culmination of Kratos' murder story, with it being the biggest game in the terms of bombasticness, full of excellent combat refinements, and by far the goriest and bloodiest of them all. So what do I like about God of War 3? Well, the combat feels like the ultimate evolution of the God of War kit, with the distant closing enemy grab really pulling it all together, pun intended. This game is really fun to play. On that note, the game's pacing is also pretty much perfect. All these games have had really great pacing, to be frank, but this one might be the best one of all. And this game looks incredible. I have no clue how this game ran on the PS3 without everybody's systems exploding, but even now on the PS4 remaster, it looks good enough to be a modern game, no joke. Absolutely insane graphics and artistic direction here. When it comes to the bad, I'm going to be fully transparent, I hate this game's story. The whole yet another MacGuffin is so stupid it feels like comedy, and Kratos just kind of gets told what to do the whole game. And speaking of Kratos, I feel they went too far with him in this game, turning him from an anti-hero to a villain. I get that it's a Greek tragedy, fall from grace thing, but he's never punished for his decisions. Here he's just kind of a huge asshole, solidified by the now infamous Poseidon priestess scene, scene, then trying to rehabilitate him with Pandora just doesn't work. And lastly, it still has that God of War problem of any weapon besides the default chainswords feeling unnecessary. At least the fists have actual puzzle and combat usage, but the other two are just kind of, yeah, whatever. As you know, our games here on a 3-point scale, must play, maybe consider, don't bother. I do think God of War 3 is a must play. It does so much right. And while I will admit my hangups on the story are probably a personal thing, I do feel a bit vindicated because they definitely tried to rehabilitate the character in the reboot. But I can easily set the story aside and just love this game's combat, set pieces, and phenomenal visuals and scale. God of War is a hell of a bloodbath, so you should probably get out there and carve up a pantheon. Today's game is God of War Ghost of Sparta. The second PSP game made by Ready at Dawn is also one of the most ambitious PSP games ever made. Does Ghost of Sparta hold up today? God of War Ghost of Sparta was released on PSP as mentioned, and an HD version was put on PS3. Similar to Chains of Olympus, this game was available via PlayStation Now, but when they switched to PS Plus, they took it off, so the only way to currently play it is on original hardware or via the E-word, but regardless, the game will take you around 7 to 8 hours to get through. So what exactly is God of War Ghost of Sparta? Well, similar to the rest of the games in the series, it is a third-person action game, so if you've seen any of the other reviews, you probably are getting tired of me explaining what it is, so let's get to what's actually different. First off, the story. Like all of Ready at Dawn's God of War spin-offs, they focus more on Kratos as a character rather than an enormous overarching plot. Ghost of Sparta takes place between God of War 1 and 2, where a now god Kratos discovers his brother Deimos, who was stolen by the gods when Kratos was just a boy, is actually still alive, whisked away by Thanatos, the god of death. The other gods obviously aren't super into Kratos digging up this relic of his past, but he's determined to anyway, and thus sets off to find his brother and amend lost wrongs. In terms of locations, God of War is extremely ambitious, leaning heavily into interesting real or real-ish locations such as Atlantis, which, yes, you do sink it, Sparta, and the lands of the dead. The story also does a great job humanizing Kratos as well as setting the stage for why he hates the gods so much, considering what they have done to his family, which greatly helps that transition between God of War 1 and 2. In terms of combat, there are a few unique additions here. The first big one is the ability to add fire to Kratos' blade by holding R1, which will exhaust a recharging meter. Fire not only does more damage, but it also pierces armored enemies, requiring some more combat awareness. The second is the single additional weapon, a shield and a spear, and is one of the few secondary weapons in this franchise that I feel is actually worth using. The shield can block projectiles, and the spear is a free ranged option a la God of War 3, meaning I actually used the secondary weapons in this game. Combat is also much improved, probably because this game came out after God of War 3, and this one has a larger variety of enemies than the previous PSP game, as well as larger scope overall. And honestly, there's not much more to say here. It is more God of War, just slightly trimmed down for the PSP, though not nearly as much as Chains of Olympus, with some really great story moments, interesting combat improvements, and oh yeah, this game looks really good. So what did I like about God of War Ghost of Sparta? Well, as mentioned, this game's combat feels absolutely incredible, with the inclusion of just one extra weapon that's actually useful, the fire imbue ability, and the new magic feeling just really good. This, God of War 2, and God of War 3 all just feel fantastic. Secondly, this game looks absolutely mind-blowing on a PSP, but even the HD version on PS3 still looks very good, which helps that it's paired with some fantastic set pieces, action segments, and just bombastic spectacle that feels just as good as its console counterpart. And lastly, this might be my favorite God of War story out of all the old school God of War games, with the focus on Kratos and his relationship with his brother and mother the centerpiece, and it really allows for some depth into Kratos' character that you don't get much in the other games. When it comes to the bad, despite its improvements, this game definitely still feels a little watered down when compared to its console counterparts, even if it is a bit closer than the previous one. Additionally, this still has some Ready at Dawn jank here, with some button prompts not showing up when you expect, some wonky platforming, and a few frustrating elements. And lastly, and this is me reaching a bit, this game and Chains of Olympus are currently impossible to play legally on modern systems because Sony took all of the collection down. Not being able to play the game, I'd say, is a pretty big negative, so Sony, maybe you should, bring this back, please? As you know, our games here on a 3-point scale, must play, maybe consider, don't bother. I think you should absolutely play Ghost of Sparta, and it is an overlooked game in the franchise, and thus a hidden gem. Ghost of Sparta might be my second favorite of the old school God of War games, no joke. I feel like with this one, Ready at Dawn leaned into what they are good at, telling an excellent story with Kratos, paired with some fantastic combat and very engaging set pieces. Ghost of Sparta provides everything I want out of a God of War game, and in spades. It's really a shame that a lot of people overlooked this one because it was only on the PSP, so if you like this franchise, make sure you play this one any way that you can. Today's game is God of War Ascension, the finale of the old school God of War games. God of War Ascension is yet another prequel to the trilogy. Is this swan song worth playing today? God of War Ascension is available on the PS3 and only the PS3. However, you can stream it through PlayStation Plus Premium to your console of choice, and the game is about 8 to 9 hours long, depending on your difficulty. So what exactly is God of War Ascension? Well, Well, it is, again, a third-person action game with a focus on insane set pieces, brutal combat, and Kratos being a crazy murder man, but this time you can reverse time and clone yourself. Hooray! A large chunk of the story is told in flashback and a flashback within a flashback, but the gist is the whole thing takes place before God of War 1 and Chains of Olympus. Kratos is haunted by visions of his dead family until Orcos, son of Ares, comes to Kratos to help him break his oath to the God of War, which will free him from his visions, allegedly. Doing so brings about the wrath of the Furies, primordials who punish oathbreakers, so Kratos needs to deal with them as well as figure out how to be free of Ares' bondage. Combat has a few smart changes and some not so smart ones. First, Kratos doesn't get new weapons this time, yay, but instead can infuse his weapons with up to 4 elements, which will change his moveset. Moves aside, this also will affect the type of orbs enemies drop as well as change the magic he can use, which is a pretty neat idea, except you can't switch elements mid-combo, unfortunately. They've also changed the way grab works, and now you can tether enemies to Kratos and keep fighting with the extra chains, something that looks kind of dorky and actually doesn't really add a whole lot to the combat, if I'm being honest. It does make executions a lot easier, as you can now grapple execution without having to be right next to enemies, which I did appreciate. You can also now pick up weapons enemies drop and use them with circle, with things like bows, spears, swords, and so on. They are decent, and you can also hold circle to do a big weapon destroying move for massive damage. When it comes to the set pieces, they are just as bombastic as ever, with its intro section in particular being particularly nuts. You'll go from a Titan prison to some magical snakes near a temple to a massive statue that you'll have to repair using time magic. This leads you to the game's 2 big unique mechanics. First, an item that'll let you either fast forward or reverse object in time, leading to some clever puzzles, and additionally the ability to clone yourself, which you mostly just use for crank puzzles if I'm honest. And again, there's really not a ton to say here, as the game fundamentally is the same as the rest of the game's pre-reboot, with its focus on violent combat, crazy set pieces, and Kratos' ever-growing anger, just with some changes that I don't know if I really love. So what did I like about God of War Ascension? Well, the elemental weapon swap ability is a great inclusion that works well in providing Kratos with an assortment of weapon combos without having to add superfluous other weapons like in the previous series. Additionally, it still definitely evokes that bombastic, over-the-top murder fantasy you get from these games, even if it's starting to feel a bit more of the same at this point. And lastly, I think this game still looks quite good, even without a remaster. With some fantastic art direction and particularly cool new enemies, it is another game that really showcases the PS3's prowess. When it comes to the bad, there are some really poorly designed instant death segments here, and honestly most of the platforming in this game feels worse than the rest of the series except the first game with its spinning Hades wheels. I particularly found the puzzles this time around to be more obnoxious than fun. They look cool on paper, but they really just kind of bog down the pacing. And speaking of the pacing, as mentioned, I don't feel like this game's pacing is particularly great. The God of War games are really defined by their breakneck, absolutely frenetic forward momentum that keeps you going. Ascension's goals end up feeling a bit more nebulous, which makes that driving energy fizzle out a bit. And lastly, this game is marred with technical issues, particularly an inconsistent frame rate throughout, which I found to be worse via the PlayStation 5 streaming, but when I booted up on the PS3, it still had those issues, though just not as bad. As you know, right, games sharing a 3-point scale, must play, maybe consider, don't bother. I think God of War Ascension is a maybe consider. As the enter to the old school God of War games, Ascension isn't quite the dud people have made it out to be, but it certainly shows that the formula was getting a little tired. While it definitely delivers more of the same Kratos murder chains gameplay, it's marred by not only technical issues, but some really weird design decisions, a janky story, and just less interesting combat. It's not a bad game, certainly struggling because it was released after God of War 3, but if you're really itching for more Kratos murder, it will deliver. Hello and welcome to 3-Minute Gaming. I'm Nathan, and I'm going to tell you this game's worth your time and bandwidth. Today's game is God of War 2018. God of War Ragnarok comes out today, and since I don't get games early, I'm playing the original one first instead. Does this first of the reboot duology still hold up? God of War is available on both PC and PlayStation, and it's also available through PS Plus as one of the Essentials collections, meaning you can get it for free. Should you wish to buy it, it's usually only around 10 to 20 bucks, and the game will take you around 20 to 50 hours depending on how much of a completionist you are. So what exactly is God of War 2018? Well, it's a refresh / return to the original God of War series of games, which are third-person action games starring their Spartan turned god, Kratos. Now, Kratos lives in the frigid north of Scandinavia, abandoning his life as a Greek god of war and trying to stay in hiding. This changes, however, with the key event that starts the game off. Kratos' new wife has died, and her last wish was for Kratos and his son Atreus to take her ashes to the highest mountain in the realms. It's a surprisingly tender story, one that reminds me of Kratos' origins in the first God of War game rather than what he became in the rest of the series. These two characters drive the story as you traverse in various realms of Viking mythology, meeting gods and beasts alike in your quest. God of War previously was a fully linear experience, and this refresh mixes that up a bit. While zones and areas you'll explore often are of a linear nature, they're connected by semi-open world zones. From this area, you can either continue to larger linear quest zones or simply explore for new resources and XP, new areas popping up as the game progresses. And you'll want all that stuff as combat has been adjusted. Kratos starts with the Leviathan Axe, a weapon he can toss and then recall much like Thor's Mjolnir, as well as engage in both light and heavy attacks, as well as your usual blocks, parries, and eventually up to 2 special moves. The combat is oddly similar to the original game, just with a new perspective, and this is further accented by a second weapon you'll get later, which I will not spoil. Enemies now have both health and a stun bar. Should you fill the stun bar first, Kratos can do one of his trademark brutal executions, with certain enemies being more susceptible susceptible to one type of damage or the other. All of this gear is upgraded, as well as Kratos' and his son's armor, weapons, and skills through a fairly standard gear and enhancement system with the crap you find. Of course, the graphical fidelity should be mentioned, as the game looks incredible even on a base PS4, though it'll play at 30 FPS, but certainly shines most on a PC or PS5. The game also still retains its bombastic set pieces, grandiose visuals, and their reverent but somewhat transgressive interpretation of the Norse pantheon, all of which plays together to keep things interesting. So all in all, God of War is a third-person action game with its emphasis on story, set pieces, and bombastic action. So what do I like about God of War 2018? Well, the combat is really good, with it still having that bit of a floaty, overpowering feel you got from the original God of War games, just with a different camera angle and some new toys to play with. Let's just say that tossing and recalling the axe in particular feels like the most badass thing ever. Additionally, this game's production values are through the roof, from the exceptional graphics, especially on PC, to the phenomenal voice acting, ridiculous over-the-top set pieces, and everything else. This game's polish oozes from every pore. Lastly, I really loved what they did with these characters, particularly how Kratos is just the worst father ever, but more so how they managed to make this guy who is less of an actual character and just kind of the embodiment of murder in the first batch of games, and made him into a deep, relatable guy. There are some really fantastic character development and moments here. When it comes to the bad, the middle portions of this game certainly lag a bit, with the game starting and ending strong, but its central dozen-ish hours bogged down a bit by the semi-open world portions that aren't really as exciting gameplay-wise. And on that same note, the plot's pacing feels all over the place. And while the big moments really shine and are quite fantastic, the slower parts do drag, with the old, we're almost there, oh wait, just kidding, we have to go do something else, happening so often I'd almost call it a motif. It's kind of comedic. And lastly, the weapon upgrade system just kind of feels less fulfilling and more like busy work. There's nothing I really got excited about, and having to play around in the menus to min-max which axe pommel would enhance some particular ability felt out of place with the rest of the game's flow. As you know, I rate games here on a 3-point scale: must play, maybe consider, and don't bother. Big shocker, God of War 2018 is still a must play and is fantastic. And honestly, I was even more blown away by it replaying it 4 years later on the PC than when I first played through it on a PS4 Slim. I cannot wait to see how the story ends with Ragnarok. Hello and welcome to 3-Minute Gaming. I'm Nathan, and today I'm going to tell you if this game's worth your time and bandwidth. Today's game is God of War Ragnarok. Kratos and Atreus are back to cause trouble with the Norse pantheon. Is this finale of the new God of War story Armageddon worthy? God of War Ragnarok is available currently only on PlayStation, both PS4 and PS5, where the next gen version is $70 and the old gen version is $60, and the game will last you around 20 to 50 hours, depending on how much of a completionist you are. So what exactly is God of War Ragnarok? Well, it's less a sequel and more a second half of a story that started in 2018's God of War, continuing Kratos and his son's story as they try to navigate Ragnarok and its god-ending prophecy. After the events of God of War 2018, Kratos and Atreus have been hiding for several years as Fimbulwinter has chilled Midgard out. Atreus, however, is concerned with the prophecy of Ragnarok and what it means for him and his father, and the two of them set out to try and uncover what exactly lies in store for them and if they can defy its destructive fate. While the first God of War's themes revolved around making connections, familiar or otherwise, Ragnarok is more focused on understanding and defying a perceived inevitability, be that a world-ending event in the case of Ragnarok, or one's repressed nature in terms of Kratos and Atreus. There's also multiple themes around growing up and letting go, trust, forgiveness, and they all tie together quite well while Kratos and his teenage Atreus butt heads. The gameplay loop itself is identical to the first game, where it's essentially a semi-open world Kratos Metroidvania. You're tossed into large areas with an objective, but you are free to explore around for side quests and goodies should you wish. These areas are generally bigger than in the first game, with one particularly massive area unlocking in the latter half, meaning there's a lot to find and do. Combat is also basically the same, though with some minor tweaks. Gear has been made much more interesting, now with different shields, augments for basically everything, and an amulet system that applies set bonuses. As you use your various skills, they gain mastery, which means you can now augment them to improve their various stats, such as adding an element or more stun, which allows for more build diversity. Another new gameplay tweak is Kratos and Atreus aren't always teamed up, with Atreus going out on his own several times throughout the game. Atreus' combat is basically just a more basic Kratos, as he only has one weapon, and while he's gone, Kratos gets a handful of new companions with varying abilities as well. It should be obvious that this game looks great, especially on PS5 where it can run at 60 FPS, with minor graphical improvements over its predecessor and some great art direction. So overall, God of War Ragnarok is less a sequel and more continuation of the first game, keeping all the things that worked and adding onto them as needed. So what did I like about God of War Ragnarok? Well, I found the combat is still excellent, with even more skills to upgrade and augment, moves to unlock, and enemies to fight. This feels like a much more fleshed out version of the first game's combat to me. Additionally, this game's production values are again through the roof, with incredible art design paired with technical prowess, phenomenal voice acting, and exhilarating set pieces. And lastly, this game's story is just fantastic, and minus some minor pacing and consistency of voice issues, it does an incredible job of not only ending this duology in a satisfying way, but also resolving Kratos' arc that began all the way in the first God of War. If you are a fan of this franchise, just let it be known, the ending here is going to be a very satisfying one for you. When it comes to the bad, the game does have the same issue as the first one, where the middle drags a bit, both story pacing and general game flow. I'd personally recommend sticking to the story and then doing all the side stuff in the post game, because that really helps the story pacing a lot. Additionally, the parts where you play as Atreus aren't really super amazing, at least compared to Kratos, as his kit is generally more basic and he doesn't have the same level of upgrades as his father. He's not bad, he's just way less interesting. And lastly, this game doesn't do a lot to differentiate itself from the first game in terms of gameplay, loop, etc., which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but some might find it a little too much more of the same and be disappointed. As you know, games here on a 3-point scale, must play, maybe consider, and don't bother. God of War Ragnarok is absolutely a must play. It is a fantastic second half of an already fantastic first game that is bigger, bolder, and more exhilarating. If you liked the first game, you should absolutely be playing this one, and if you haven't played any of the God of War games, I really recommend at least playing these two, as they piece together into one of the best duologies in gaming. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you played God of War Ragnarok, have you beaten it? Did you name your firstborn Atreus? Let me know in the comments, but regardless, go out there and make sure you play it.